There was a Ma'un, the Bible so feared. Even hell whispered when he walked past. He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't a king. He was the one who killed a lion in a snowy pit with his bare hands. He was God's silent blade, the shadow standing between the throne and the dark. A man heaven chose to do what no one else dared. And then he vanished. No parades, no glory. But both angels and demons remembered his name. This is not a story about victory. It's about obedience in the silence. Watch until the end. God will bless you. There are men who are not born to be remembered in history books, nor to stand atop pedestals of honor. They walk among shadows, like the breath of God itself, unseen, but ever present. They appear only in moments the world prefers to forget, yet heaven insists on recording. People don't tell stories about them over dinner tables, but the fear they instilled in darkness still whispers through generations. Among the legendary names of Scripture: David, Solomon, Samson, Elijah. There is one name seldom spoken, yet every time it is the wicked tremble and angels lower their eyes. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, the man who once stepped down into a pit on a snowy day to face a lion and never looked back. They say that day was unlike any other. The sky was bruised gray, as if heaven itself hovered with a warning. Snow fell in thick, suffocating silence, burying the earth in a shroud that blurred the line between life and death. Every living thing sought shelter, save for one wild beast and one man. No one knew why Benaiah was there. There was no campaign, no battle, no political assignment to explain why a soldier would descend into the bowels of winter to meet death head-on, except for one possibility: a summons from within. A call that required no language, no reasoning, only a pull from the divine that urged a soul to step into a place where nothing guarantees survival. Perhaps this is how God chooses his vessels. Not with thunderbolts or beams of glory, but through bitter cold and the growl of a hungry lion trapped beneath ice. Picture it, if you dare. A pit carved deep, slick with frozen mud, the kind of place where your footsteps betray you, and the chill in your bones feels like prophecy. The lion wasn't injured. It wasn't bound. It was pure, unbroken instinct, rage wrapped in fur teeth honed by hunger. And it knew it wasn't alone. No one forced Benaiah into that hole. No prize awaited him. There was no crowd, no applause, no promise of reward. Just a man with snow melting in his hair, his eyes fixed, his hand wrapped around the hilt of a weapon, as if it were the last breath he had left. And he jumped. In that single moment, the world paused. The snow stopped falling. The wind held its breath. Heaven looked down. Hell sat still. And beneath it, all the soul of a warrior and the soul of a beast faced each other in a silence only those who have tasted death could ever understand. No one knows how long the fight lasted. Maybe seconds, maybe an eternity. But when his form rose again from that icy grave, blood steaming on his fingertips, and something unnameable glowing behind his eyes, the witnesses knew this. The lion was dead. But something else had also been buried in that pit. From that day forward, Benaiah was no longer just another warrior. He ceased to be a name on the roster of David's soldiers. He became a living myth, not for the strength of his arms, but for the stillness after victory. He did not boast. He did not shout. He did not bask. He killed, but did not celebrate. He conquered, but did not rejoice. He walked away as if the lion had been more than flesh and fang, as if it had been the shadow of fear itself, and he had slain that too. Perhaps that was the true reason God chose him, not because he lacked fear, but because he had descended into its darkest form and emerged untouched. God saw it. David saw it. And so Benaiah was given an assignment no one else dared accept, to become the personal bodyguard of the king. Not a showpiece commander or a loud general, but the silent shadow that stood just behind the throne where betrayal was suffocated before it breathed, where rebellion was cut down before it drew form, where justice wore no mask, only presence. A young soldier once asked, "Why did King David choose him?" An old man replied, "Because no one else ever looked a lion in the eye and returned still a man." But that was only the beginning. Time passed. David aged. The kingdom grew uncertain. Politics curdled. Bastard sons and legitimate heirs began circling the throne like wolves. Amid the tension, David fell quiet. Then, one day, he summoned Benaiah, not with commands, but with a look. No one knew what passed between them. But the next day, Adonijah, David's rebellious son, was dead. Joab, the once revered general, was executed. There was no army, no trials, no debates, only one man and a blade that made no sound. They called Benaiah God. But he didn't kill to destroy. He killed to preserve. And the ones he removed were not men of virtue. They were living embers, threatening to set the kingdom on fire. To him, every drop of blood spilled was a prayer. Every stain on his hand was a whispered lament to the Almighty. "Forgive me, for I am but a sword in your grip." And God did not turn away. He looked on, not with judgment, but with the solemn nod of a creator who knows that in a fallen world, sometimes holiness requires the hand of a warrior. Solomon rose to power, but wisdom alone could not safeguard a crown. A throne needs divine protection. Benaiah became commander of the armies, not because he was strong, but because he was calm. And from that day forward, Solomon's empire was not just ruled by law, it was guarded by a quiet fear that bore the name of the man who once killed a lion in the snow. No one knows when Benaiah died. There's no lavish tomb, no gilded monument. But those who understand the deeper rhythms of holy history still say on cold nights, if you stand outside the old gates of Jerusalem and listen long enough, you may hear a blade being drawn, not with the sound of steel, but with the rush of wind over your neck, like a warning from the sacred beyond justice is not dead for the man who carried it once lived. Not all swords are forged to shine in the sunlight. Some are made to dwell in the shadows, to whisper judgment in the dark, and to strike without echo. Benaiah's blade was one of those. It didn't gleam, it remembered. It didn't sing, it listened. And in its silence lived the weight of divine instruction, sharpened not by fire, but by obedience. Benaiah had become something more than a soldier, more than a warrior. He had become the hand of God when justice could no longer wait. As David's life dimmed, like the final wick of a once roaring flame, the kingdom trembled. The walls of the palace could no longer contain the murmurs. Adonijah, a son of David, handsome and ambitious, declared himself king, while his father still drew breath. He did not wait for death, and he did not seek the will of God. He gathered chariots, nobles, and feasting halls, not realizing that in doing so, he had summoned his end. For Benaiah still served. And Benaiah did not forget the covenant David made with the Lord, that Solomon, not Adonijah, was the chosen heir. When the moment came, there were no horns, no public trial, no crowds, only a silent order whispered to the man who needed no explanation. Benaiah found Adonijah, and when he left, the feast had become a funeral. Joab, the former general, whose loyalty had long grown thin, fled to the altar, clutching the horns with trembling hands, invoking sanctuary in a house he had forsaken in his heart long ago. Benaiah stood outside, waiting not for Joab, but for the word of the king. When it came, strike him even there, he obeyed. And though it shocked many that a man would shed blood at the altar, Benaiah knew justice has no location. It follows only the will of the holy. There was no triumph in his eyes, no satisfaction, only silence, as always. He carried out judgment like one who had seen the face of war and survived not joyfully, but unflinchingly, because he did not kill for power, nor glory, nor vengeance. He killed to uphold what was sacred, and he carried each life taken as a wound that bled inwards. His soul bore scars no eye could see. Solomon knew that his wisdom would not be enough without the shadow that kept chaos at bay. So he gave Benaiah command over the armies of Israel, not because of strength, but because of silence. And Benaiah, ever faithful, stood watch not over the throne, but over the righteousness that gave the throne its meaning. He rarely spoke, but his presence silenced rooms. Courtiers adjusted their robes. Guards stood straighter. Even wind seemed to shift its course in his presence. It was said that no dog barked when Benaiah passed, that no child cried. Because the spirit of war walked with him, but it bowed to holiness. At night, he would stand under the stars, alone, eyes toward heaven. Not praying aloud, just listening. For the one who called him into the lion's pit still called him now, not into battle, but into discernment. When danger whispered, Benaiah already knew. Solomon never had to ask how. He just trusted that the man who once slew death itself in a pit of snow would know when death came again. And when young men asked Benaiah the secret of his strength, he did not speak of weapons or training. He only said, "I fear the one who sent me more than I fear the enemy who faces me." That was all. And it was enough. Benaiah's legend was not built in the light, but in the stillness between storms. He stood not as a man seeking power, but as one preserving promise. He did not stand on mountaintops. He stood at thresholds between kings and killers, between order and anarchy, between heaven and the things that threatened it. And when he raised his sword, it was not his voice that echoed, but the silence of a God who does not shout, but always sees. Even now, when the snow falls heavy and the wind turns cold, there are those who believe that Benaiah's spirit still walks, not as a ghost, not as a warrior, but as a question. When the lion appears and the pit is cold and no one watches, will you step in? There is a place between the holy and the profane, a threshold no man dares to guard unless he has died in spirit and been resurrected in obedience. Benaiah was such a man, not because he was fearless, but because he feared only one thing, the absence of God. He stood between kings and chaos, not to shield power, but to defend what heaven had ordained. He did not protect thrones. He protected covenants. For when kings forget the voice that made them kings, judgment comes not with lightning, but with footsteps. They called him commander, but he never saw himself as such. He was not above his soldiers. He was beneath something greater. Every night, he stood at the palace gate, not for appearances, but because he could not sleep, while unseen things prowled. He knew darkness did not always come with swords or soldiers. Sometimes it came with smiles, whispers, or even scripture misquoted. And so he watched not with suspicion, but with discernment. Because those who dwell closest to the fire know how cold the world can be without it. Some say he had visions, moments where his breath would still and his eyes would glaze, not in madness, but in knowing. Others called it paranoia, but Benaiah knew better. He once said, "There are enemies who come through gates, but the greater ones come through hearts." So he learned to read the unseen, a twitch in a brow, a hesitation in speech, a silence that lingered a second too long. These were his signs, not omens, but patterns, echoes from the spirit that trained his soul more than his sword. Once, A noble came with gifts and golden promises, seeking favor through subtle bribes. Benaiah said nothing. He only stepped forward, and the man withdrew his lips, drying like parchment in the wind. No words, no accusation, just the look of a man who had killed a lion in the snow, and who knew when a man's tongue carried venom. It was not death that made people fear him. It was the mirror he held. For Benaiah had become like a living threshold. When you stood before him, you saw not just yourself, but the parts you tried to bury. Sin trembled near him, not because he condemned it aloud, but because holiness does not need to speak to expose what is rotten. And he carried that holiness like a cloak woven from shadow and fire. Solomon once asked him, "What do you fear most?" And Benaiah replied, "That I might mistake my own voice for the Lord's." It was a terrifying honesty, not the answer of a general, but of a prophet. He did not trust himself. He tested every instinct against the stillness inside. If peace did not follow, he waited. Even if war pressed at the gates, even if death whispered names, he waited until the Spirit whispered back. He had no temple. His altar was the battlefield. His prayers were sweat and silence. And yet, he was more priest than warrior, for he offered something costlier than sacrifices his will. Every time he obeyed, a part of him died and was reborn not in triumph, but in trust. The people thought he served Solomon, but Benaiah knew his true king sat higher. It is said that once a child wandered into the royal courtyard at night. The guards had fallen asleep, but Benaiah was there, kneeling, unmoving eyes to the sky. He heard the small footsteps and turned. The child did not flinch. He asked, "Are you an angel?" Benaiah smiled faintly and said, "No, angels do not bleed." Then he took the boy's hand and led him back to safety, one silent step at a time. That is how Benaiah lived, between blood and glory, between shadow and truth. He was not loud, but he was never absent. He was not fast, but he was never late. He was not honored often, but he was never forgotten by those who knew what true safety felt like. For safety is not the absence of enemies. It is the presence of someone willing to fight what no one else sees. Even now, long after his name faded from royal scrolls, his legacy lingers in every man who stands between corruption and calling. He reminds us that God does not always send fire. Sometimes he sends a man who does not blink in storms, who does not bow to threats, who walks into the pit on the coldest day, not to conquer, but to obey. And so, Benaiah remained keeper of the threshold, guardian of the unspoken law, warrior of quiet flame. And if you listen on nights when justice groans and truth hides behind trembling walls, you may still hear his footsteps, not marching, not charging, just walking, slowly, purposefully, as if death itself remembers and chooses another path. They called him a soldier. They called him commander. But neither title could capture the truth. Benaiah was an echo of something older, something divine. When he walked, it was not just his footsteps the ground remembered, but the weight of every judgment he had ever carried. He was not flesh only. He was memory wrapped in armor. There was a time when the kingdom knew peace. Solomon's wisdom held the nations in awe. Gold flowed through the streets. The temple rose like a promise carved in stone. But peace is not the absence of evil. It is its restraint. And restraint must be enforced. Hidden among the marvels of the new reign was a darkness still breathing, waiting for distraction, for pride, for forgetfulness. But Benaiah had not forgotten. He walked the outer courts, the back halls, the forgotten stairways of power, not as a man lost, but as a man who understood that holiness is never fully safe from decay. There were those who thought him unnecessary in a time of wisdom. Advisors whispered, "Why do we need the lion slayer now? There are no more lions." And yet, Benaiah knew better. Lions do not always come with claws. Sometimes they come dressed as priests. Sometimes they sit in council. Sometimes they quote scripture with poisoned breath. And so he stayed. Not because he was needed, but because he was faithful. His mission was not dependent on public threat. It was rooted in obedience to the one who never sleeps. He grew older, but the fire did not dim. His steps were slower, but no less certain. Young officers passed him in the halls and mistook silence for softness. They did not understand the weight he carried. For Benaiah had seen what judgment looks like from the inside. He had felt it tremble in his bones before it fell. He had killed at the altar. He had walked away from blood still steaming on sacred ground. He had heard the voice of the Lord in snow and in stillness. And once a man hears that voice, he never doubts again. He only waits. One day, a conspiracy was uncovered. A minor court official, forgotten by most, had been secretly aligning with foreign powers, passing information, poisoning minds, sowing subtle disorder. There was no war, no rebellion, just slow corrosion. Solomon was hesitant. The man had friends, family position. He was clever, influential. And Benaiah said nothing. He only listened, watched. And then he stepped forward, not with accusation, but with presence. The man confessed before he was touched. No guards drew blades, no interrogation. Just Benaiah's eyes, steady, ancient, unreadable. The man collapsed under a weight no one else could feel. He sobbed like a child. "How did you know?" He gasped. Benaiah only replied, "I saw the silence behind your words." And that was all. Because some men do not uncover secrets. They carry light, and secrets die in its glow. It was not just criminals who feared him. It was the uncertain, the half-hearted, the proud. He did not inspire rebellion nor devotion. He inspired recollection. When he walked into a room, people remembered their oaths. They remembered their lies. They remembered that righteousness still had eyes. And those eyes had killed a lion in the snow. He never used titles, never asked for reverence. But when he prayed, even the wind bent closer. He did not shout. He whispered. His words were like embers, soft but burning through the veil between heaven and earth. One servant swore she once saw light flicker in a dark corridor, but there were no torches. Only Benaiah standing still, lips moving alone in prayer. Some said angels walked with him. Others believed he had become one. But Benaiah himself never claimed glory. He still bled, still aged, still wept when no one saw. He remembered the faces of every man he ever brought down, not to mourn them, but to guard himself. For he knew how close justice and pride often sleep. And he feared more than failure, that one day he might act from himself and not from the Lord. So he waited before every decision, waited in stillness, waited until the peace of God descended like dew. Only then did he move. And the kingdom endured, not because Solomon was wise, but because Benaiah was watching. His legacy was not gold, not scrolls, but silence, the kind that kept darkness from breathing too deeply, the kind that lived in the corners of power, reminding all that someone still carried the weight no one else could lift, a living echo of divine restraint. A man who had killed monsters, but never stopped fearing the one who sent him to do it. And when he vanished from the records, when his name no longer passed lips, when new generals took his place, and new kings rose on softer convictions, the wind still whispered, the halls still paused, the shadows still trembled. Because though Benaiah was gone, the echo remained, and the echo still walked. He had lived longer than most thought he would. Long past the days of lion pits and executions, long past the crimson echoes of revolt and secrets shattered under his gaze. Benaiah walked slower now. His beard bore silver, and his hands trembled only slightly. But no one dared mistake him for weak. Time had not eroded him, it had distilled him. He had become less visible in the courts of Solomon. Not dismissed, no, just quieter. Like thunder after a storm has passed, but not yet finished. Those who ruled thought peace permanent. They smiled, they relaxed. But Benaiah knew peace is not the absence of noise. It is the space where shadows recover. There were nights, long, heavy, starless, when Benaiah would walk the edge of the city alone. He did not speak. He listened. Not for enemies, but for the silence inside himself. and he began to hear something he had not known before questions. Not loud ones, but subtle, like soft winds through temple curtains. Was he still useful? Had the voice that once called him into the pit now gone quiet? Had he somewhere along the way become more sword than soul? He had killed without hesitation, not in cruelty, but in clarity. Yet clarity is a dangerous thing if left unchecked. It can become pride, and pride, as he knew well, walks in robes of light. So he began to pray differently, not as the lion slayer or the commander, but as the old man who feared his armor had outlived its purpose. He asked for dreams again, for signs, for softness. But heaven answered not with thunder. It answered with silence. And in that silence, Benaiah began to remember things he had once buried. The face of the lion in the pit, not snarling, but pleading. The weight of Joab's blood, not rebellious, but exhausted. The trembling of his own hand the day he drew his sword in the temple. He had never doubted the voice that led him. But now he wondered, did he ever ask where it was leading? Was justice a place, or had it always been a person? Was obedience enough, or was love still the greater law? These questions did not weaken him. They humbled him. And humility, Benaiah discovered, is not the lowering of strength. It is the lifting of one's heart above one's scars. He began to spend hours in the outer courts of the temple, not for ritual, but for nearness. He did not ask for atonement. He asked for closeness. Let me not grow so strong that I cannot be held, he whispered once. Let me not become so feared that you cannot find me. One morning, he encountered a boy, barefoot, bruised eyes, hollow with hunger. The guards moved to strike the child for stealing dates from the royal baskets, but Benaiah raised his hand. No, he said gently. Then, kneeling before the child, he removed the ring from his own finger, a small, unadorned band once given to him by David himself. He placed it in the boy's hand. This will open more doors than stealing ever will. The boy looked at him, not in gratitude, but in wonder. Are you the king? He asked. Benaiah smiled. No, child. I am the sword that learned how to bow. That night, the dreams returned, not of lions, not of battle, but of hands scarred luminous, reaching down into a pit and pulling him out. He awoke in tears, not from regret, but from recognition. He had not outlived his purpose. He had simply outlived the version of himself who needed to prove anything. He was no longer the hand of justice. He was now the heart that remembered why justice mattered. The kingdom changed. Faces changed. Laws changed. But Benaiah remained, not as a commander, not as a shadow, but as a witness to what happens when obedience gives birth to transformation, when the sword lays itself down at the feet of its maker, not broken, but whole. And in that final season of his life, people came to him not to seek judgment, but wisdom, not to learn how to fight, but how to be still. In the end, there was no war. There was no uprising, no final duel, no glorious battle under banners of fire. There was only quiet. Benaiah, the lion slayer, the commander. The shadow of justice had become an old man. His armor hung untouched, no longer needed. His sword rested on a stone shelf by his sleeping mat, unpolished yet clean. He still walked, though slower, still watched, though less often. But in his stillness, there was more awareness than ever before. He no longer scanned the horizon for enemies. He watched the soul. He had become a temple within himself, a sacred silence, a living scroll of what it meant to walk faithfully, fiercely, and then release. Solomon still ruled. The palace thrived. But fewer people came to Benaiah for orders. More came for presents. They asked nothing. They only sat beside him. Some wept. Some confessed. Some simply breathed easier near him, as if the world held its breath until they were close to whatever fire still burned quietly in his chest. There were rumors that angels still walked the corridors when Benaiah prayed. Others said even death was afraid to take him. But death was not afraid. Death was reverent. It waited outside like a servant waiting to be summoned, not to claim, but to escort. And Benaiah knew, not with fear, not even with sorrow, but with a knowing that filled him like warm oil poured from heaven's own jar. He had always believed that dying in battle would be his end, but God had reserved something different, a gentler battlefield, a quieter pit, a final moment, not of blood, but of breath. In the final days, he returned to the outer wall, the same stones where he once stood alert, defending the sacred. Now he came not with sword, but with psalms. He recited not war cries, but whispers of gratitude. He remembered each face, each order, each kill, each act of mercy. He laid them before the Lord, not as trophies, but as burdens finally released. Here, he prayed, is the life you gave me back. It was never mine. Let it now return to where it came. He looked up into the sky and saw no visions. He saw no chariots of fire, no thrones splitting clouds, only stillness. And in that stillness, peace so deep, it almost hurt to feel. One evening, he did not come back to his quarters. The servants searched. The guards whispered. Some feared the worst. They found him beneath a fig tree, not fallen, not collapsed, but seated, as if waiting for a friend. His eyes were closed, his breathing still. One hand rested on his knee, the other open toward heaven. And in that moment, it was said that the wind stopped moving, not in fear, but in respect for a man who had been both sword and sanctuary, who had been the justice of God, and yet chose in the end to become its mercy. They buried him with no parade. He had asked for none, just a stone plain and uncut, carved only with one phrase. He stepped into the pit and never stopped walking, and that was all. But heaven knew the rest, and it sang, not loudly, but deeply, the kind of song only eternity can hear. And somewhere beyond the veil, a lion lay at peace, and a warrior rested at last. He expected nothing, no gates, no angels, no trumpets. Benaiah had lived his life without demand, and he entered death the same way quietly as one who knocks not with his fist, but with his breath. And when the veil thinned, when the cold of flesh gave way to something neither warm nor cold, but full, he did not awaken in a garden. He awakened in a silence more alive than sound. It was not heaven, as poets sang. It was not the blinding light that blinds. It was something deeper, a field of stillness, a place beyond questions, beyond vengeance, beyond mission. He stood barefoot, clothed not in linen, nor light, but in memory. Every moment of obedience, every tear of restraint, every battle fought only when commanded, they clung to him not like armor, but like fragrance. His sword was gone, his title gone. Even his name began to feel distant, but something remained, something eternal. Before him stood no throne, no figure, only presence. He did not see. He knew. It was not God standing there. It was God everywhere. He fell, not as a gesture, but because standing became impossible. Everything he thought sacred had only been a shadow of this. He wept, but the tears did not fall. They rose, upward, like incense, returning to the fire that once birthed them. And then he heard it, not with ears, but with soul. The voice, the one he had followed through battle, through silence, through betrayal and blood. It did not speak in Hebrew, or thunder or flame. It spoke in remembrance. In every moment he had obeyed when he could have resisted. In every time he withheld his sword, when pride whispered strike. In every step into danger for the sake of another. The voice said only one thing: you knew me, and that was enough. There was no review of sins, no courtroom, no trial, only recognition and joy that burned without searing. He had been many things: a soldier, a killer, a shadow. But here he was, only one thing, known. Then came others, not faces he had slain, but faces he had saved by not killing. Children who grew because he walked the wall one more night. Sinners who turned back because he stood beside them, silently. One by one they smiled, not as those who honored a hero, but as those who recognized a brother. And he felt his soul rise, not in rank, but in surrender. Every weight he had carried fell away like chains never truly locked. And he saw, for the first time, not what he had done, but who he had become. Not the lion slayer, not the sword of Solomon, but the friend of the flame, the companion of the unseen, the beloved of the voice. And then the voice said again, "Come." No light appeared, no door opened, only a deep pull toward unity. And he stepped forward, not to receive reward, but to become what he had always shadowed: peace. They say that every man wears a crown, even if invisible. Some wear it in pride, some in shame. Some polish it daily. Others pretend it doesn't exist. But for those like Benaiah, the crown cannot be seen in life. It is forged in the hidden moments, the ones without witnesses. In the snow pits, in the pauses before the sword is drawn, in the decision to obey when no one will applaud. That is where glory is born, not in battle, but in the stillness before it. Benaiah did not leave behind good or children or songs. He left behind a silence, a kind of silence that still lives in the corridors of King, that lingers in the space between right and easy, That breathes in the hearts of those who have stared into the lion's mouth, whether that lion be fear, temptation, violence, or silence itself. He is not remembered in sermons. His name is not etched into temple columns. But when a man chooses honor without reward, when a woman stands her ground for truth in secret, when someone listens for the voice of God before they speak, he is there, not as a ghost, but as a memory carried in heaven's breath. For Benaiah became more than man. He became a threshold, a question, a call. What if you lived as if obedience was the reward? What if you fought not for outcome, but because righteousness is a sword that must be held? What if you walked into the pit on the worst day and never needed anyone to see you do it? That is the legacy of Benaiah, not the lion, not the throne, not even the sword, but the invisible crown. It shines brightest in darkness. It weighs nothing, yet anchors eternity. And somewhere tonight, in a world full of noise, ambition, and shadow, there is someone standing alone. No applause, no safety, just silence and a choice to obey, to endure, to walk forward, even if it means stepping into the cold with only faith as fire. And when that person takes one more step, the crown is lowered, not by angels, not by kings, but by the same voice that whispered over Benaiah's soul, "You knew me," and the flame continues, unseen, but never unfelt. You've heard the story, not of a king, but of the man who stood behind the crown, not of miracles, but of a soul who obeyed in silence. Benaiah's sword is gone, but his legacy lives wherever someone chooses truth over comfort, courage over safety, obedience over applause. And now, it's your turn. When the lion roars in your life, will you step into the pit? Even if no one's watching, God sees, and He remembers. If this story stirred something in you, share it. Subscribe. Let the word move forward. And never forget, those who walk in hidden obedience are never hidden from heaven. Thank you for watching. May the Lord bless you and keep you in every silent battle ahead.